They were auctioning off a mother like cattle. 5 children beside her, silent in the heat. No one spoke, no one stopped it, until one man did. Silas McCrae raised his hand, not to rescue, but because something in him refused to stay silent any longer. He spent his last dollar that day, but what he brought home wasn't a burden. It was the beginning of a family, built not by blood, but by courage, kindness, and the will to stand against what's wrong. If you believe a single choice can change everything, stay with us. They were auctioning off a mother like livestock. That was the first thought that stuck in Silas McCrae's mind, bitter and hot, as he watched the widow step onto the courthouse platform with 5 children clinging to her skirts like torn ribbons. The wind kicked up dust around her boots, and for a moment, she stood still as stone while the world decided her worth. The Wyoming sun bore down without mercy. July heat shimmered off the wooden courthouse walls, warping the edges of decency. The crowd didn't speak. They just stared. Silas stayed near the edge of the square, leaning against a post with his arms crossed, a man who had promised himself he'd feel nothing ever again. But some silences were too loud to ignore. He hadn't come to save anyone, least of all himself. He'd come to watch other people lose, same as him, and leave feeling less alone in the wreckage. His mortgage was weeks from default. His ranch hung by a thread. His wife's hairbrush still sat on the mantel, untouched for 16 months. He had no business getting involved, but there was something in the widow's posture, proud, rigid, resigned, that made the ground shift beneath his boots. Her name was read aloud like a sentence. Hannah Delaney, widow of Thomas Delaney, deceased. 5 dependents. All assets to be liquidated under court order. The children didn't cry. Not even the smallest. That silence was worse. Barrett Cole, the wealthiest rancher in 3 counties, raised his hand. He chuckled as he did it, the kind of man who dressed cruelty in charm and called it business. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke. The law was the law, and Cole had come with a wagon hitched and waiting. Then Silas heard his own voice. $100, he said. Not loud, just steady. The square froze. The auctioneer blinked. You bidding, McCrae? Silas nodded once. Every cent I've got. Barrett raised again. So Silas stood straighter. Around him, whispers turned to action. Someone offered $10. Another, 5. One woman passed her brooch to the clerk. A shopkeeper held up a silver spoon. No speeches. Just small, stubborn kindness. The kind that spread like prairie fire when someone dares to strike the first match. Minutes later, the gavel fell. And with it, something else cracked open inside Silas McCrae. A silence he didn't know he was ready to leave behind. The wagon wheels groaned as they crossed onto Silas McCrae's land, brittle, wide, and worn. The sun was slipping west, casting the ranch in gold and shadow. Dust curled up from the road in tired spirals. Behind them, the town shrank into memory. Ahead, the house stood like a question. One Hannah Delaney didn't yet have an answer for. She sat stiffly on the splintered bench beside Silas, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The children rode in the back, huddled among bundles in silence. No one spoke. It wasn't the silence of peace, but the kind that came from too many thoughts pressing at once. She stole a glance at the man beside her, square-jawed, grizzled, his eyes unreadable beneath the brim of a dusty hat. He hadn't smiled since the auction. Hadn't looked at her, really. Just nodded when she asked if her youngest could ride up front, and then said nothing more. When the house came into view, 2 stories, paint long peeled, one shutter hanging askew, Hannah braced herself. It wasn't worse than she expected, but it wasn't better either. A front porch sagged beneath years of weather. The barn leaned like it had secrets, and the wind carried that sharp, empty smell of a place too quiet for too long. Silas hopped down first, then helped her down without a word. His hands were calloused but careful. Then he turned to the children. One by one he lifted them down, even Rebecca, the eldest, who was tall and proud and didn't like being touched. He didn't force a word, just helped, then stepped back like a man trying not to scare wild animals. House is clean, he muttered. Ain't much, but the roof holds. You'll take the upstairs. Hannah nodded, her voice caught behind the iron gate of her ribs. She took the children inside, their footsteps unsure on the warped floorboards. The air smelled of pine and ash. Someone, probably him, had opened windows to let the light in. A basin of water sat on the kitchen table. Beside it, 6 mismatched tin cups. She paused there. Not for long, just long enough to understand that this man, whatever else he was, or wasn't, had tried. That night, they ate in silence. Salt pork and beans. The children sat straight and still, afraid to ask for more. Silas kept his eyes down. Hannah watched him carefully. She didn't know what to make of him. This man who spent his last dollar on strangers and then kept his mouth shut like a vow. When the children were put to bed on mattresses filled with old straw and prayers, Hannah stepped out onto the porch. The stars above the plains burned sharp and endless. She wrapped her shawl tighter and leaned against the railing, listening to the wind press through the grass. Inside, she heard Silas stoke the fire. No words, no footsteps, just the quiet echo of 2 lives rearranging. The days settled in like silt in a riverbed, slow, silent, and steady. There was no grand transformation, just routines repeated, chores done in parallel. Children fed and dressed, eggs gathered, water hauled, wood chopped. No one asked questions. No one made demands. At first, they moved around each other like ghosts. Silas rose before the sun. She heard his boots cross the porch before the sky even thought of light. He'd feed the horses, patch the fence, then return long after the children had started lessons at the table. Hannah took to teaching them again, her voice soft but firm as she led them through their letters, numbers, and maps drawn in charcoal on brown paper sacks. She didn't ask for permission. She simply resumed the life she knew how to live, one that gave her some sense of steadiness, of worth. He never interrupted. Sometimes he'd stand at the door with his hat in hand, watching. She could feel his gaze, low and quiet, not hungry, not expectant, just there, like the wind at your back when you're not looking for it. In the late afternoons, they worked near each other. Silas at the barn, Hannah in the garden that had been left to choke in weeds. She'd cleared a patch with her own 2 hands and a borrowed hoe. Emma, her second youngest, helped pluck out rocks with a determined little grunt. Christopher, the baby, napped in a basket nearby, shaded by an old flour sack nailed to a post. The work wasn't easy, but it filled the hours with something that wasn't fear. Sometimes he'd bring her nails, or water. Once a pair of gloves that had belonged to his wife. He left them on the porch railing. No note, no explanation. She wore them anyway. At supper, the silence softened. Rebecca asked if they could plant carrots. Jacob whispered something about chickens. Silas replied in single words, then full sentences. Hannah noticed that he'd started washing his hands before meals. Rough palms scrubbed pink at the knuckles. He never said grace, but he always waited until everyone had been served before lifting his fork. On the 7th night, the stove broke. Silas spent 2 hours in the dark fixing it, cursing under his breath while Hannah held the lantern and tried not to laugh at how many times he bumped his head. When the fire finally caught and the room warmed, something shifted. She handed him a tin cup of warm cider. He nodded. Their fingers brushed. Neither pulled away. It wasn't affection. Not yet. But it was something. The kind of something that grows in the quiet, where sorrow makes room for gentleness, where 2 people begin to hear each other in the silence between words. It was the ledger that gave her the first glimpse into his loneliness. She found it one morning on the kitchen table, half covered by a dish towel and a jar of nails. The ink had bled in places, numbers scratched over other numbers, whole months missing, expenses logged in guesswork and crossed out frustration. Silas had meant to fix the ranch, but like grief, the work had outpaced him. Hannah didn't ask. She simply sat down with the book after the dishes were done, smoothing its creased spine with careful fingers. Rebecca sat nearby, reading aloud from an old reader. The younger ones built forts from flour sacks and hay twine. The wind hummed through the window panes, and the house felt almost warm. That evening after supper, she handed the ledger to Silas without a word. He looked at her like she'd reached across a canyon. "These 3 vendors are charging double," she said softly. "Your fence repairs bleeding you dry, and you're paying for hay you never received." Silas didn't answer at first. He just stared at the numbers, then at her, then back again. "I was a school teacher," she added, her voice steady, "before Thomas died." Still, he said nothing. But the next morning, she found the ledgers laid out in order. Clean pages, a pencil set beside them, an invitation. From then on, their silence carried purpose. She showed him how to record expenses, how to keep track of calf births and equipment repairs. He taught her how to gauge the wind, how to spot snake trails in the dust, how to mend a fence so it held against more than just cattle. They didn't talk about the past or the future, only what needed doing. But in the doing, something softened. One night, Jacob scraped his knee and cried loud enough to echo. Silas came in fast, faster than she expected, crouched down, his voice gentler than the night before. "You're all right," he said. "Ain't nothing that won't scab over." He looked up at Hannah then, as if waiting for her judgment, but she only handed him the salve. Their hands touched again. This time he didn't flinch. She started baking bread every morning, not because he asked, but because it made the house smell like something that wanted to be lived in. He repaired the back steps without telling her, left a new hair ribbon for Emma on the table one morning, blue like the sky before storm. Still, neither of them spoke the things that hovered just beyond reach, about why he had bid that day, about what he hoped she would become, about what it meant to feel safe in a house again. But sometimes at night, she'd see the lamp burning in his window, long after the rest of the house had gone still, and she wondered if he too was listening to the silence, not for ghosts, but for a heartbeat that didn't yet have a name. The first time Barrett Cole rode up to the ranch, he didn't dismount. He just sat there on that sleek black gelding, hands folded over the saddle horn, his smile thin as a branding iron. His hat cast a long shadow across his face, but his eyes still gleamed, sharp, cold, and too familiar. The children scattered like quail at the sight of him. Hannah stood on the porch with the baby on her hip, her jaw set, her feet planted. Silas stepped out of the barn with a pitchfork in one hand, and a look that said he was no longer the man who had stayed silent in town. "Well, well," Barrett drawled, glancing toward Hannah. "Looks like you've built yourself a little orphanage, McCrae." Silas didn't answer, just stared, the kind of stare that warned a man how far he was willing to go without saying a word. Barrett's smirk grew. "Don't worry, I'm not here to take her. Just came to remind you, the land you sit on? I've been eyeing it a long time. Your debt's a noose, McCrae, and no amount of charity changes that." Hannah stepped down one stair, shifting the baby to her other hip. "You've made your point, Mr. Cole," she said calmly. "Now you can ride on." Barrett looked at her, really looked, and for the first time there was something like unease behind his eyes. He tugged the reins, turned without another word, and vanished into the dust. That night, Silas slammed the ledger shut harder than necessary. "He's not wrong," he muttered. "I'm hanging on by splinters." But Hannah didn't look afraid. She looked focused. She pulled out a folded paper from her satchel, one she'd never mentioned. The ledger from her late husband's business dealings. Debts, contracts, and receipts, some of them bearing Cole's name. Her fingers traced a line across one page. "He's been overcharging smaller ranchers for years," she said. "Charging for supplies never delivered. Using ghost contracts to pressure land sales. My husband owed him more than he should have. But I have records." Silas stared at her. "Why didn't you show me this before?" "Because I wasn't sure what kind of man you were yet," she said quietly. He didn't flinch, just nodded once. They spent the next week digging through the records, matching receipts, tracing paper trails, building something that looked a lot like truth. Hannah wrote letters, quiet, formal, pointed, to the territorial office. She spoke with the sheriff, who had long shrugged off Cole's behavior as harsh but legal. But numbers didn't lie, and Hannah Delaney knew how to make numbers speak like thunder. That same week, Cole sent a man to make threats. The man didn't make it past the porch. Silas met him with a shotgun across his knees and a voice low as storm clouds. "You tell Barrett," he said. "The woman he tried to buy is under my roof now." And then, in a softer voice without looking away, "And I'm not for sale either." The fire came just after midnight. It started in the barn. Dry hay, old timber, wind at its back. Silas was the first to smell it, smoke curling under the door like a warning too late to stop. By the time he ran outside, flames were clawing up the rafters, red and wild against the black sky. Sparks leapt to the wind like panicked birds. The cattle were bawling, shadows thrashing behind the corral. He didn't shout, didn't waste time. He just ran. Hannah was already on the porch, wrapping blankets around the children, barking orders with a calm that came from having faced storms before. "Water, Jacob, go! Rebecca, take the little ones down to the creek bed. Stay low, stay quiet, don't look back." Silas and Hannah fought side by side, her hauling buckets from the trough, him soaking the roof with anything wet. The barn was lost. The fire took it fast and furious, like it had been waiting. But the house held, just barely. By dawn, all that remained of the barn was a smoking skeleton and the smell of scorched earth. One calf had burned, 2 chickens gone, but the family was safe, and Barrett Cole's message was clear. He didn't want to fight. He wanted surrender. The sheriff came that morning, called out of sleep by Rebecca, who'd run barefoot to town before sunrise. His face was pale, his voice tight. He'd been turning a blind eye to Cole for years, because it was easier, safer, quieter. But seeing the Delaney children huddled under quilts, their eyes rimmed with ash and fear, something cracked open in him. "I'll need proof," he said. "Real proof." Hannah placed the ledgers in his hands, the same ones Cole had signed, the same ones she had copied 3 times, tucked into flour sacks and stitched into the lining of her coat. "Then do your job," she said. Word spread fast. Too fast. By afternoon, the ranch wasn't quiet anymore. Neighbors came, men and women who had once crossed the street to avoid Silas in town. They brought buckets, boards, nails, bread. One woman, childless and silver-haired, brought blankets she'd sewn for grandchildren who never came. No one said sorry. They just showed up, hammered, hauled, stood guard. That night, Cole returned, this time with 3 men, armed, mounted, faces hidden beneath scarves. But he didn't expect what he saw. 24 townsfolk standing shoulder to shoulder on the McCrae porch, tools in hand, rifles visible, the sheriff among them. Silas stepped forward. So did Hannah. "You picked the wrong house," Silas said, his voice like gravel. Barrett didn't speak. He just turned his horse in silence, his power, like the fire, burning out before his eyes. And in the quiet that followed, someone began to hammer a new beam onto the frame of what used to be the barn. A sound like rebuilding, a sound like defiance. The warrant came 2 days later, carried in the saddlebag of a marshal from Laramie, with a star dull from travel dust, and a voice that didn't need to raise itself. He took one look at Hannah's ledgers and nodded. The evidence was clean, damning, and layered in Cole's own handwriting. Ghost contracts, false accounts, threats, extortion. Enough to bury him not just in court, but in every newspaper from Casper to Cheyenne. Barrett Cole was arrested in the middle of the general store. He didn't shout, didn't resist, just looked around at the faces watching. All faces that had once feared him, now cold and unmoved, and understood that his time had ended. The law had finally caught up to the man who thought he owned too much to fall. When word reached the ranch, Silas didn't smile, but he stood a little straighter. He looked at Hannah across the supper table and said softly, "That was you." She didn't claim it. Didn't need to. The ranch still sat raw and wounded. The barn blackened, the roof patched in places. But something was changing. There was movement. Laughter from the children during lessons. Loaves of bread left cooling on neighbors' porches. The beginning of fence posts stretching toward the North Hill where Silas had always dreamed of running cattle but never dared. Then came the letter. Folded crisp and official. Marked with a seal. The Union Pacific Railroad was offering Silas McCrae a contract. They needed cattle, hundreds of them, moved monthly through the new route heading west. It was Hannah who had sent the inquiries, run the numbers, written the proposal, and it was her handwriting that marked the margins. Neat, economical, brilliant. "This changes everything," Silas said, looking down at the paper. Hannah was quiet for a moment. Then, "No. It just makes what you already had. Enough." He didn't know how to thank her, so he didn't try with words. Instead, he built a new coop behind the house for the children's hens, bought a proper slate board for lessons, laid new steps on the porch and repaired the shutter that had clattered in the wind for over a year. Every nail he drove was a word he couldn't say. And at night, when the children were asleep and the stars shimmered like scattered salt across the velvet dark, he'd sit on the porch and listen to the stillness. Not empty, not anymore. The kind of stillness that came from peace. Sometimes Hannah joined him. She never asked for company, but she didn't sit far. And when Silas looked at her, hair loose from its usual braid, shawl around her shoulders, eyes half closed to the wind, he began to understand. This was not the ending he'd braced for. This was the beginning he'd never thought he deserved. It happened slowly, like thaw. No declarations, no sudden shift, just warmth where there had been cold, space where there had been distance, and the quiet unfolding of days that no longer hurt. The children were the first to change. Emma began leaving little drawings on Silas's workbench, lopsided horses, smiling suns, stick figures with wide hats and bigger hearts. Jacob followed him into the pasture without being asked, mimicking the way he coiled rope or checked hooves. Rebecca, slowest to trust, started setting 2 cups of coffee on the table in the morning instead of 1, always without a word. It was baby Christopher who said it first. "Pa." Silas froze, a half-carved wooden toy in his hand, sap still wet against his knuckles. The boy had toddled in with mud on his boots and laughter in his voice, climbed into Silas's lap like he'd been doing it forever, and said the word like it had been waiting for a place to land. "Pa." Hannah heard it from the doorway and didn't correct him, didn't look away. That night, as they sat on the porch watching a storm build over the hills, Silas said quietly, "I'm not trying to take his place." Hannah answered just as softly, "You didn't. He gave them life. You gave them peace." The rain came gentle, drumming across the porch roof like a lullaby. They sat through it together, shoulders inches apart, hearts even closer. Inside the house, things took on a new rhythm. She sang while kneading bread. He started whittling toys, a habit he'd thought lost. They read books aloud in the evenings, mostly to the children, but sometimes when the fire had died low and the littlest ones were asleep, they kept reading, to each other. Once, when Hannah caught a splinter, Silas took her hand, rough in his, careful, and worked it out with the tip of a needle. She didn't flinch, just watched him, the way one might watch a river after the ice breaks. Not because you're afraid, but because you can't look away from something becoming itself again. Still, no one spoke of love. They didn't need to. It was there in the way he moved a candle closer to her page, in the way she mended the fraying edge of his coat, in the way they shared space without asking. Not passion, not possession, but presence. Something sturdy, something built slow. And on a late September evening, as the sky burned orange over fields that had once seemed barren, Silas found himself watching her laugh, really laugh, and knew that whatever life was before, this was the part that mattered. Not because it was loud, but because it was true. They married in October, beneath a cottonwood tree that still held its gold. There was no organ, no white dress, no church bells, just a gathering of neighbors in their Sunday best, hands clasped, faces open. The same people who once whispered in alleys now stood in a half-circle of hope, hats pressed to chests, boots dusted for the occasion. The children picked wildflowers and laid them along the path. Rebecca made Hannah a crown from dried prairie grass and tiny blue blooms. Jacob carved a ring box from pine. Silas wore his best shirt, the one with the collar Hannah had sewn back into shape. His hair was combed, his boots were polished. His heart, steady and strong, beat louder than the wind that stirred the leaves above their heads. Hannah walked barefoot through the dust, her dress clean but simple, a ribbon tied at her waist the same color as Wyoming sky just after rain. Her eyes found his, and neither of them looked away. The ceremony was short. Words were spoken, not flowery, not dramatic, but full. Promises not of perfection, but of presence, of standing, of choosing. When the preacher asked who gave this woman, Emma said, "We all do." And Christopher, clapping his small hands, laughed loud enough to echo. They exchanged rings forged from simplicity, from the same silver dollar Silas had once kept in his pocket as a keepsake, melted down, shaped new, made to last. Afterward, they ate peach pie and drank coffee from chipped mugs. Someone brought a fiddle, someone else a quilt for the ground. Children ran through fields, chasing each other like wind. Grown men cried into their sleeves and didn't apologize for it. The sheriff raised a toast. "To second chances," he said. "To families made, not born." Hannah stood beside Silas hand in hand, her children circling like roots around a tree that had finally found water. And in that moment, Under the canopy of turning leaves, the McCrae ranch no longer felt like land barely held together by nails and willpower. It felt like home, not a rescue, a rebirth. Silas looked at her then, the lines in her face etched by fire and years, her strength so quiet it nearly went unseen, and he felt the last pieces of himself settle into place. This woman, who had come into his life not asking for anything but shelter, had given him back the world, not the one he'd lost. A new one, grown with care, fenced with trust. And as the sun dipped below the hills and the shadows stretched long and kind across the earth, he leaned close and whispered, "Thank you for staying." She didn't answer. She just rested her head against his shoulder, and in the hush that followed, even the wind held its breath. By winter, the land had settled into sleep. Frost laced the fence posts like lace spun from breath. The fields, once scorched and cracked, now bore the heavy hush of promise, soil resting, not barren. The barn stood strong again, timber hewn by neighborly hands, its roof thick with new shingles and dusted in early snow. Smoke curled steadily from the chimney. The ranch no longer sighed under its burdens. It breathed. Inside, the house glowed, not with wealth, but with warmth. Boots by the door, bread cooling on the windowsill, quilts folded with care, a row of tin mugs drying beside the sink, and the sounds of family. Jacob's questions tumbling over themselves like spring runoff, Rebecca reading to her siblings by firelight, Emma humming as she braided her sister's hair. Even silence had changed its shape, no longer hollow but full of peace. Silas sat at the kitchen table one evening, running his thumb over the smooth edge of a wooden horse he'd carved, his 12th, maybe 13th. A gift for Christopher's birthday, though the boy had no need for toys when snow offered endless joy. Across from him, Hannah sipped her tea. Her shawl had slipped from one shoulder, her hair loosed from its pins. She looked tired, and at peace. The kind of peace born not from ease, but from endurance, from doing the hard thing again and again, and still waking up with an open heart. "I used to think I'd already lived the best parts of my life," Silas said quietly. Hannah didn't speak. He looked out the window, where the moon hung low over the white field like a lantern held out in offering. "But I was wrong." A pause. "The best part is this, waking up beside someone who stays." Outside, the wind pressed gently against the walls, not as threat but reminder, that even in the coldest season warmth could be made, that even the hardest land could soften, given time and care and patience. In the attic, tucked beneath wool and cotton, lay the ledgers, bound now in order, updated and clean, proof of what was taken, but also of what was reclaimed. Not for vengeance, but for future. They hadn't rewritten the past. They'd built a better tomorrow in spite of it. And that, Hannah knew, was the quiet miracle of their story. Not the rescue, not the romance, not the victory over a cruel man. But this, a table with 7 chairs, a house no longer haunted, a man who'd believed himself too broken to love again, now carving horses in the dark just to see a child smile, a woman, once sold as debt, now holding the deed to her own life, and the land itself, stitched back together by boot prints, raindrops, and the steady, unremarkable grace of staying.